I'm really excited about today's first guest because this is a subject very dear to my heart, and that is the people's voice. The people's voice in our republic, as set up in this democracy, it's about the vote. I think the vote's being suppressed in many ways. I think the vote is being washed away in many ways, sometimes literally. And you can find executed ballots, weeks after the election in some box somewhere in the corner of some state. And so how we vote and continuing to get out the vote, I think, is a critical part of the people's voice being heard, especially during COVID-19. Because, and then my preamble will be over after this last point, I think these kinds of situations, these crisis situations, in this case COVID-19, are oftentimes seized upon by special interests to destroy things like the people's voice and destroy your ability to be heard through the vote. And so that's why it is my pleasure to welcome Adam Eichen, and Adam has dedicated himself through Equal Citizens to just this, getting out the vote and the people's voice being heard through the vote. Hi, Adam.
Mark, thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
There is a lot of talk now with COVID-19 of sort of what's going to happen when election day comes. How can we still vote in some kind of timely fashion? The mail-in vote, the absentee votes. Can you touch on sort of the state of the state when it comes to these things?
COVID-19 is going to disrupt our elections unless we act. But the good news is that we know exactly what to do to crisis-proof our elections. There's really no question about that. We know that if we expand vote by mail, making it easier to vote absentee, providing robust early voting periods, online voter registration, same-day voter registration, allocating enough money so election officials can be adequately staffed and that they can, pay for postage and many other things. These are the reforms that we need to be thinking about right now. Many people want to push this off. They want to kick the can down the road because, rightfully, there are many, many pressing issues right now, including, public health, the economy. But now is the time that we have to act, even though it's months away, because these election reforms take time to set up. You can't just snap your fingers a week before the election and, have a slew of reforms to crisis-proof our elections. The time is now. So the bad news is we don't have too much time. And the bad news is we have to act now, and Congress doesn't really seem to be super eager to do that, especially in the Senate with Mitch McConnell and the president right now. But the good news is that we know exactly what to do. We know which reforms work. And it's just really a matter of willpower and, whether or not Americans are going to get engaged to fight for these necessary reforms to ensure that no one has to choose between their health and the right to vote. Because that's ultimately what this comes down to, is we do not want anybody facing that choice. The recent elections in Wisconsin were an example of what happens when you force people to make that choice. And it's plainly unacceptable.
Well, you touch on the fact that there is not a whole lot of time, and you also touch on the fact that, you have a Senate controlled by the GOP, which seems to me has a vested interest in, on some level, suppressing the vote. So the two work together in if they can just delay this. In other words, they can be co-conspirators in delaying. I'm talking about GOP legislators. You may see in just that delay what you're talking about, which is suppressing the vote and an inability to get some of these specific reforms in place in time for the election. So what would you like to see us do? I mean, the average citizen, what would you like to see when you say it's about willpower? Okay, you've got my willpower. Now what do I do?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. So you're absolutely right that Mitch McConnell and the president don't seem particularly eager to pass these democracy reforms, despite them being absolutely critical to a free and fair and legitimate election in November. But one thing we can do is we can pressure the Democrats, who have expressed a willingness to push for democracy reforms in response to this crisis, to make this a red line in negotiations, to say no more money, no more stimulus unless you safeguard our elections, unless you allocate over $2 billion, as the Brennan Center for Justice estimates is needed at bare minimum to adequately fund our elections in this crisis. We need to make sure that congressional Democrats are holding firm on this and really making this a sticking point in negotiations, because there is leverage because this is a moment where things have to get passed. So making sure this is a red line is critical. But also, I don't want to make viewers think that the only action is in Congress. We're seeing states across the country actually reform election laws to make them more accessible, whether it's easing absentee requirements or sending out voters absentee request forms. But there's a slew of things that can be done on a state level too. And I think that making sure we're putting pressure on state officials is also critical, especially if you live in one of the handful of states that still require an excuse to vote absentee. That everybody in America should have the right to vote by mail if they're fearful of COVID. I feel like that's an incredibly reasonable thing to do. And moreover, and I think we'll talk about this a bit, I also think that there's tremendous obligation for media organizations to really prioritize getting out information about voter registration and how to request an absentee ballot. A colleague of mine, Josh Douglas, a law professor at the University of Kentucky, and I wrote an article for Talking Points Memo arguing that media organizations should be, putting links to, for example, vote.org on anything related to elections, or even newspapers could print voter registration forms as part of their Sunday editions. These are all things that newspapers, media organizations can do to ensure that voters are educated about reforms that are taking place. Because, Mark, I'll just say this, that we can change all the laws we want and we can do it quickly. But if voters don't know that they all of a sudden have the right to vote by mail, then those reforms don't mean as much. So in addition to changing the laws, we, the collective we, ordinary citizens talking to their family, and media organizations like TYT, have to do their part to ensure that voters know about how to safely cast a ballot, how to register to vote, when the voter registration deadlines are, when the deadlines for requesting an absentee ballot are. There are a lot of different steps in this process coming up to November, and it's all hands on deck. It's not just lawmakers.
I love that. I love that point. I really think it seems as though the media may be a linchpin to public awareness. I mean, that would seem to follow, but that's the danger of this COVID-19 era, which distracts the media in large measure from some of these messages. Like, as you say, just the fact that 39 states have online voter registration, that kind of lost in the shuffle because it's sort of, is there a vaccine for COVID-19 yet? So I think in the daily news wash, the priorities of voter registration and voter options can kind of get lost.
Yeah, and it's not the coolest issue to be talking about voter registration months before the election. But Mark, in a normal presidential election cycle, right, most voters are getting registered through government agencies like the DMV or through registration drives by the League of Women Voters, for instance. But those things aren't happening right now. So, the campaigns can't quite go door to door. And so there's going to be a registration crisis unless there's massive public education that you have to register before the election day in many states. I mean, these things for people who right now are worried, having just lost their job or might soon lose their job, or they're worried about a family member who's getting sick or, might be at risk of getting sick. Thinking about elections months in advance is not necessarily on the forefront of their mind. And so it's up to us to make sure they get the information that they need, because election day might roll around. And then if you're in a state where there's a 20 or 30-day registration window, you're out of luck. You can't vote.
That's such a great point. It's one, honestly, it hadn't even occurred to me that you're right. All of the normal ways even that one might have access to voting have changed. And we just don't know when those systems that we're sort of used to in almost a perfunctory way, you mentioned the DMV and all that, when they will return.
Exactly. And that's why it's so critical that we push not just Congress, but state lawmakers to act, because states could, for example, send every unregistered voter a registration form. States can send ballots to every registered voter, as well as 5 states currently do, and California currently in transition to do that as well. There are many different reforms to actually get the information into the hands of voters through governmental action. So it's not just a media thing. It's also, much more effective if lawmakers step up and do exactly what they need in terms of best practices to ensure that information gets into the hands of voters. but not every state legislature is acting appropriately. And that's where media organizations, civic groups come in to try and bridge the gap where lawmakers aren't acting appropriately. So ideally, right, we want Congress to act.
I have to say, at a time when I think this republic has a lot of problems staring it in the face, and I mean systemic problems and governmental issues that are raised by the COVID-19 crisis. In other words, I think there's really you could almost say a crisis of conscience about what's happening in this country and the systems that are set up. I like this emphasis that you have on some of these very things, and I hope you get the word out through all of these different organizations. And because as you, I mean, I understand. Let's review your organization on the website, but there are also others along the way. Just quickly in our last couple of seconds, give us the web addresses and where people can get more information, please.
Sure. So I'm the campaigns manager for an organization called Equal Citizens. You can find us at equalcitizens.us. But please share the link to vote.org. They have all the information you need to register to vote, how to request an absentee ballot. Please get the word out. And if you read the article on Talking Points memo, email your local newspaper or state newspaper, try and get them to follow the advice that Josh Douglas and I lay out. The more newspapers and media organizations we can get that to spread the word about voter registration and how to request an absentee ballot, the more we're going to able to have a functional democracy in November.
It's a righteous fight, and I wish you good luck.
Thanks so much, Mark.
Thanks for watching this free clip of the Young Turks. Don't forget to become a TYT member today. For more exclusive content, join now at tyt.com/join.